Hi, my name is Abby Jones, and today I will be presenting my research on the impact of racial disparities in school-based disciplinary actions. I wanted to start off with a little bit about myself. Here's a picture of me and just a little bit of information. I have been a behavior disorders teacher in Des Moines Public Schools for 4 years now. I am about to graduate from Morningside College with my graduate degree in special education. And a few things before we get started, I just wanted to throw in there some of my passions are social justice, anti-racism, and social emotional learning. So this is very near and dear to me. Why this research was important. Brown versus Board of Education, we're all familiar with desegregated schools, but there is still so much more work to do. I apologize, I might be moving myself around quite a bit. But the purpose of this research are students who experience severe punishment from schools at a higher risk of suspension, expulsion, and academic deficits. Also, will incorporating restorative practices such as social emotional learning and anti-racism professional development to teachers reduce the disciplinary actions among students of color. The problem is clear. Our African Americans are more likely to be victimized by crime than any other group. Our African American males make up only 24% of students that are enrolled in public schools. However, they make up 48% of students that are suspended and 49% of students that are expelled. It's clear that removing students from school has a significant impact on academic achievement and directly contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline. Schools with higher suspension rates have lower test scores, and dropout rates lead to many negative long-term effects. It's important to note that students that receive suspensions and expulsions are disproportionately given to Black students more often than their white counterparts. Some students also prefer the punishment of being out of class rather than being in class, which results to just adverse effects of the punishment. Again, Black students are disproportionately recipients of school suspensions, and dropouts lead to many long-term effects such as fewer job opportunities, earning a lower wage, incarceration, reliance on public assistance, substance abuse, and much more. So now to go into the impact, zero tolerance policies in schools are not straightforward. It's also important to know implicit biases as we dive into this. So I defined it first. Implicit biases are the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Again, our zero tolerance policies are not straightforward, and they rely too heavily on whether or not a student has already had previous behavior misconduct. Overall, zero tolerance policies don't improve school safety, and they're a form of punitive punishment, which leads to lower academic performance, high dropout rates, disengagement, and many other long-term effects. Implicit biases, like I said, can change our perspective by the way that we see people and actions that we're not used to. So when educators have implicit biases, they tend to negatively impact student achievement. Again, Black students are disciplined more frequently and more severe than their white peers when displaying the same behavior misconduct. Some past interventions, punitive punishment. Historically, punitive punishment dates back many years and is racially designed. Hence the reason we should be moving away from it. Highly punitive punishment may not be as necessary as some believe. Disparities in discipline continue to negatively impact our Black students, regardless of the severity of the misconduct, like I stated before. Schools in the U.S. have felt the need to use this punitive punishment as a form of a disciplinary action to address student misconduct, but unfortunately, punitive punishment tends to disproportionately impact Black students in a negative way. Proposed interventions, school discipline should be viewed as a collaborative effort. It shouldn't just be the administrator, or shouldn't just be the campus monitor, or shouldn't just be a set of teachers. It's important that this is a collaborative effort and teachers and administrators use restorative practices. Rather than trying to control students' behavior, it's important that we implement practices like restorative practices with our students that allow them to shift that focus from punishment to more of a reconciliation process. Restorative practices provide students with more opportunities to voice their concerns, create a safe space, and allow for school staff to counsel students. Removing that punitive punishment from schools allows students to spend more time in class and less time out of school, therefore increasing their academic achievement. Schools that serve a large majority of minority students, like Des Moines Public Schools, tend to see a disproportionate rate of behavior referrals, suspensions, expulsions, and other behavior resolutions to problematic school behavior. So in the theoretical framework, I discovered behaviorism, otherwise known as behavioral psychology, and it describes how behavior is acquired through conditioning, such as operant conditioning. And basically what this says is we act and we do things based on what we're around and what we observe. So when schools move more towards restorative practices rather than sticking to their zero tolerance policies that have targeted minority students for many years, it's easier to promote things such as empathy for others, having a sense of one's own behavior, and showing more respect for yourself and others, and also to promote reflective thinking. Into the purpose statement. The purpose of this research was simple. It was to determine if there are racial discrepancies in school-based disciplinary actions. Punitive punishment focuses solely on what happened, and the interventions are put in place to try and decrease the behaviors from happening, whereas restorative practices have a deeper understanding of the misconduct and that it could be a direct result of a failure to meet needs. Restorative practices use interventions that tend to offer additional support to increase that positive behavior in the future. For years, schools in the U.S. have tried to find the right approach when dealing with student behavior. Oftentimes, schools focus solely on the academic aspect of things rather than allowing academics and behaviors to coexist. When schools use punitive punishment, they are really just creating future barriers for their students, especially those of color, sometimes without even recognizing the long-term effects. In the ongoing pursuit to create positive school culture and boost morale, schools should move away from punitive punishment and more towards restorative practices. So into the participants and the methods of this study. The participants, they were 10 students, both in general and special education setting. They were anywhere from 11 to 14 years old in 6th to 8th grade. Students were not offered any sort of incentive to participate in this research. And to be honest with you, the students were chosen solely based on the fact that they were the top 10 offenders of receiving the highest amount of behavior referrals in one comprehensive middle school building. There were no print materials used. The researcher just used the Des Moines Public Schools database, Infinite Campus, and a Tableau report. And also, during the professional development, the teachers in this building were given a book by Ibram X. Kendi called How to Be an Anti-Racist. The procedure was quite simple. The researcher went to Infinite Campus and there created a Tableau report in the database and selected participants based on the following. Basically, it just went down the list and the researcher selected all of these things. 2021 school year, network level, middle school level, all genders, all race and ethnicity, all students identified as special education, ELL, and on a 504, all levels of events, level 1, 2, 3, and 4, level 1 being the lowest level of event, level 4 being the highest level, the offender role, all instructional format, and all possible motivation. So there was no really keeping anything out of this research. It was truly just finding the top 10 offenders and just diving really deep into that. Into the results. There was an independent samples t-test that was used to compare the number of behavior referrals before the teacher professional development opportunities and after. So looking at our T, it's fairly low at a 1.942. To be honest with you, the results show that the mean and standard deviation did decrease. However, the t-test result shows a very small decrease, not likely enough to truly impact the discrepancies that result in things such as suspension, expulsion, and other long-term effects. So I added our table, means and standard deviations based on professional development. So our mean for the amount of behavior referrals before our professional development was 46.7. This meant that there were about 46.7 referrals. After our professional development, these 10 students received a mean score of 22.7. So it did look like the mean decreased and also the standard deviation. Let's keep that in mind as we continue through this presentation. I really liked the way that this figure was set up. I created a bar graph displaying the minimum and maximum number of referrals based on professional development opportunities. So in the blue, we have our pre-professional development, and in the orange, we have our post-professional development. So when looking at this figure, the maximum number of behavior referrals before the professional development was 129. The maximum number of referrals after our professional development decreased about 85% at 52. So while this figure does show a significant decrease, the t-value shows the decrease was not substantial enough to support the hypothesis. I also should add that this study was done during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I truly believe that when students weren't in the building, they weren't receiving referrals. So this could also impact our referrals, our number of referrals shown here. Onto the discussion, the total number of behavior referrals did decrease. However, there was not a significant enough difference to support the hypothesis. There will need to be more support and research around anti-racism, social emotional learning, and restorative practices to support the hypothesis. I do believe that the sample size may not have been large enough, and there may not have been enough direct practice in teaching to support the hypothesis. So with that being said, there were only 10 students who were involved in this research. Now, if the researcher would have, gathered more data, maybe 20 students or 50 students, we may have had a different outcome. However, with the timing of the pandemic and with the lack of professional development opportunities due to the pandemic and teachers teaching virtually and not being in our school buildings, I just truly don't believe that there was enough direct practice and teaching to support the hypothesis. Into our implications for students, teachers, and families, I think it's important to say that implementing restorative practices does decrease the likelihood of students receiving referrals. However, there needs to be a larger focus on school-wide expectations, community support, and stronger teacher-student-family relationships. Implementing restorative practices is inclusive, it's not discriminatory, and it is fair. Families need to be seen as key stakeholders and invited to participate in the process, in the implementation, and in the sustainability of those restorative practices. When families are present stakeholders, restorative practices are more likely to succeed. I also wanted to list all of the references from my research on this page. Thanks so much.